Hello, good evening. Uh, this is John Krummel, and I'm recording this on August 16th. I want to thank Ralph Mueller for organizing this conference. It's a shame that we weren't able to get together in Germany so that we could all meet each other and discuss in person. Nevertheless, hopefully we can have some have a good exchange of ideas digitally. So my paper is called Lask, Heidegger, and Nishida, From Meaning as Object to Horizon and Place. I have given versions of this paper in other conferences. It's something I've been working on for several years. It will be a part of my book on Heidegger and Nishida eventually. It will be one of the chapters. I will begin. It has been said that Emil Lask, who lived 1875 to 1915, forms a bridge from Kant to phenomenology. This is apparent when one notices his profound influence upon Martin Heidegger, who lived 1889 to 1976. Taking the significance of Lask for Nishida Kitaro, who lived 1870 to 1945, one could argue as well that he provides the bridge from Kant to Kyoto school philosophy. Heidegger and Nishida each independently took Lask's anti-subjectivist deconstruction of Neo-Kantian dualism in parallel but distinct directions, deepening Lask's conception of a pre-thematic object paradigm, gegenständliche Urbild, and the relationship within that paradigm between category and material. While appreciating Lask's anti-subjectivism, each moved in distinct directions beyond Lask's object centrism. In the case of Heidegger, Lask's sense of meaning and validity is deepened to signify the phenomenological horizon. He explicates in terms of the temporality of human existence, providing the meaning of beings. In the case of Nishida, he assimilates the Laskian notion of a pre-judicatively livid category to his notion of a pre-objective predicate, jutsugo, in his 1926 essay, Basho, or Place, deepened in significance as indicative of a place, or basho, wherein beings, objects, or grammatical subjects are situated. For Nishida, place in its deepest sense is the place of nothing, monobasho. For Heidegger, time as horizon is the meaning of being, Sinn des Seins. Both indicate a pre-theoretically lived sense of meaning or truth, implying a network of meanings, or world, Welt, Sekai. Here I look at possible convergences and divergences between Heidegger and Nishida via Emil Lask as a common source of influence and catalyst for the development of their distinctive thinking. So the first section is on Emil Lask. Emil Lask, who lived 1875 to 1915, may have been the most original member of the Baden or Southwest school of Neo-Kantianism. He left two major works articulating his unique philosophical logic: Die Logik der Philosophie und die Kategorienlehre, or The Logic of Philosophy and the Doctrine of the Categories, from 1911, and Die Lehre vom Urteil, The Doctrine of Judgment, 1912. Lask attempted to ground transcendental logic in a realm of transcendental validity, independent of the cognizing subject. He criticized Kant for leaving out of his logical investigations the conditions for transcendental critique itself, the conditions for knowing the conditions of knowledge. Lask proposed that the categories themselves are cognized as valid forms. The object of philosophical knowledge as such is intelligibility, which logically precedes things. For categories to be objects of knowledge, they themselves must have categories, categories of categories, or forms of forms. Inheriting the terminology of Hermann Lotze, Lask discusses these logical conditions in terms of validity, Geltung, often using its verbal form of being valid, or the valid, gelten, geltendes. What are valid are forms that pertain to their material, whereby their content has meaning. Validity entails a transcendental realm, where categories of meaning, sense, value, and so on belong, independently of our judicative acts. The valid category as form must always refer to that which is beyond itself, requiring fulfillment in its material, as valid pertaining to ... hingelten ... Form requires its material, but the material content is clothed, umkleidet, encompassed, umgriffen, by the form giving it meaningfulness, Sinn. Quote, form is indicative of matter and matter stands in form, unquote. Alone, however, the material is unintelligible, alogical, logically impenetrable, brute facticity that limits reason, conception, cognition. As the logical wraps or clothes the alogical, they interpenetrate in a primal relationship, Urverhältnis. He describes the material's engagement by logical form in terms of involvement or bewandtnis, that contextualizes the particular material in relation to other material. Parallel to this, Lask espouses two fundamental domains of objects, what are valid, geltende, and what are seiende, the valid and beings. The valid are non-sensible but intelligible objects that need not exist. On the other hand, a being is a spatial temporal object that exists and can be sensed, but in itself not valid, nicht geltende. They belong to distinct categories, the domain category, Gebietskategorie, of being, to which non-valid beings belong, and the domain category of the valid, to which valid categories belong. But both domain categories are valid. The domain category of being is valid as the logical form for beings. So being is not a being. It cannot be. This means that there is a category of categories, a form of forms, allowing a category falling under another category as matter to become an object of knowledge. The category of the valid is the all-encompassing category of categories, theoretical primal form, theoretische Urform, which the category of being is one of the while the category of being is one of those valid categories. In turn, the domain categories become differentiated into more particular objects through meaning differentiation, Bedeutungsdifferenzierung, by specific material. At the bottom end of the spectrum is primal matter, Urmaterial. Between primal matter and primal form are thus levels or tiers, Stockwerke, of form and matter unities. Matter is given in our lived experience, Erleben, prior to judgment. We handle objects, not only beings, but valid content, without thematizing them, and as such they are logically naked. Lask describes this in terms of Hingabe, absorption or immersion, whereby we are given over, hingegeben, to the form, meaning, or value. Absorbed within categories, we live through them as in contexts, and so live in truth, leben in der Wahrheit. Truth as such, precognitively experienced, is non-artificial originary meaning, in contrast to cognized truth, which is an artificially reproduced, nachbildend meaning. The object, as this a priori foundation, is the paradigmatic meaning in contrast to the meaning constructed in judgments. A judgment, or proposition, in affirming or denying, may or may not be correct vis-a-vis its object paradigm, or gegenständliches Urbild. Judgment, therefore, always implies a fall, in quotation marks, fall, from the lost paradise of livid originary truth. The realm of cognitive judgment, then, is a field of oppositions that can hit, treffen, or miss, verfehlen, its object, while the transcendent realm of livid meanings is oppositionless, gegensatzlos, or trans-oppositional, übergegensätzlich. Lask's understanding of the transcendental objectivity of meaning served as a clue for both Heidegger and Nishida but both found Lask's object centrism to be insufficient. Next section is on Martin Heidegger. We see the impact of Laskian concepts in Heidegger's works from his student days up to Sein und Zeit, or Being and Time. Heinrich Rickert, his dissertation supervisor, noted that Heidegger is, quote, very much obligated to Lask's writings for his philosophical orientation as well as his philosophical terminology, unquote. As a student, Heidegger reviewed Lask's Logic of Philosophy in a 1912 article, Neuere Forschungen über Logik, Recent Research in Logic. In his 1913-14 dissertation, Die Lehre vom Urteil im Psychologismus, The Doctrine of Judgment in Psychologism, Heidegger turns to Lotz's conception, but following Lask's reading of validity, Geltung, and discovery of, quote, that decisive expression in the treasury of our German language, that besides an it is, das ist, there is an it holds, das gilt, it is valid, unquote. And that logical forms as forms of reality, Wirklichkeitsform, are not, but are valid. In his 1915-16 Habilitation, Die Kategorien und Bedeutungslehre des Duns-Scotus' Doctrine of Categories and Meaning, he repeats Lask's call for a philosophical logic, stating that, quote, logic itself requires categories of its own. There must be a logic of logic, unquote. He appropriates Lask's notion of being as a category to examine the issue of being in general, ens commun, in medieval scholasticism, stating that, quote, it is the function of form to give an object its being, unquote. He appropriates here Lask's understanding that validity signifies the involvement, bewandtnis of material. He links Lask's reflexive categories of identity and difference to the medieval transcendental category of unum, one. In the simplest tautology of ens est, the verb being, as categorial form, is the subject matter's involvement. Quote, even if it is only a matter of being identical with itself and different from something else, unquote. Being something, etwas sein, is the primal involvement, Urbewandtnis, of anything that is. Form determines the nexus of meaning and thereby the environment, or the environing world, Umwelt. Heidegger, however, was not completely satisfied with Lask's logic. It was, quote, simply not possible to compare judgment meaning with the real object, unquote, as Lask's object seemed to require, and since one knows about real objects only through cognition, judgment. Heidegger thus felt the need to go beyond Lask's object-centric logic to consider a subjective logic. Quote, forms are the objective expression of the different ways in which consciousness is intentionally drawn to what is objective, unquote. The way the object is given. Husserl's intentionality proved useful, but in turn Heidegger balances intentionality with Lask's doctrine of material differentiation of meaning. Combining Lask and Husserl, Heidegger calls for a higher unity between transcendental realism and transcendental idealism. Recognizing the unity of ideal being and historical actuality leads transcendental logic to the recognition of the living historical spirit. History as the arena of value formation is the, quote, meaning-determining element for the problem of categories, unquote. In the 1919 course, Die Idee der Philosophie und das Weltanschauungsproblem, the idea of philosophy and the problem of worldviews, Heidegger takes the a priori primal something, etwas, in the realm of livid meaning to be the sheer intentional movement that is the comporting relation, Verhalten, of out toward, and whose sense is a worlding, Welten. History, as matter in material determination, motivates the giving of norms or values. The givenness of matter and the giving of forms are dynamically united, whereby being valid, quote, being valid is a phenomenon, presupposing not only intersubjectivity but historical consciousness in general, unquote, which can only be expressed in the impersonal "it is valid" as guilt. Lotzian non-being is thus de-objectified in the anonymous event of pre-thematic life. Inspired by Lask's formulation of the reflexive category, es geben, being there, or literally it gives, Heidegger formulates his own idiosyncratic phrases to express the true locus of experience in the dynamism of the it that worlds, es gilt, es soll, es wertet, es gibt, es weltet, es ereignet sich, or it is valid, it should, it values, it gives or there is, it worlds, it owns or appropriates. In Being and Time of 1927, Heidegger develops the ambiguity of being in Lask, taking its inner distinction as the ontological difference, ontologische Differenz. He conceives the being of beings as the contextual space of intelligibility articulated in our interpretive understanding. Its structure is categorical like the valid, but occurs with our being there, or Dasein. Meaning as the material's involvement thus becomes manifest under the light of our projects. Beings are discovered as belonging to a network of involvements or relevance relating to the environing world as the contextual horizon wherein one is there, da, encountering beings at hand. Heidegger thus refers to Lask's notion of Hingabe in connection to the care structure of being there, Dasein. The result is a deepened sense of subjectivity as, quote, ecstatic throne project, unquote, that grounds both Husserlian intentionality and the emergence of Laskian object paradigms. This radicalizes Lask's Verhältnis of Bewandtnis and Hingabe through the situatedness of our projects, the facticity of our being in the world thrown into existence as finite, contingent, facing death. It was during this time that on the other side of the globe, a Japanese thinker was appropriating Lask's concepts to develop his own version of originary logic, a logic of place. So the next section, third section, is on Nishida Kitaro. Nishida's 1920s works, In Nishida's 1920s works, Lask serves as a catalyst for the genesis of his ideas. The breakthrough to his logic of place came in his 1926 essay, Basho, or Place. References to Lask first appear here, where we find more references than in any other work. Lask's name is also conspicuous in Torinokosareru Ishiki no Mondai, or the issue of consciousness remaining, of the same year. Further references appear in the 1930 Bansha no Jikakuteiki Taikei, the System of Universals in Self-Realization, and in Tetsugaku no Konpon Mondai, Fundamental Problems of Philosophy of 1933 to 34. In contrast to Aristotle's definition of substance as, quote, that which becomes the subject and not the predicate, unquote, Nishida defines consciousness logically as, quote, that which becomes the predicate but not the subject, unquote. While the subject is grammatically determinate, the predicate can be broadened in its universality to an indeterminate nothing or moot, encompassing determinate beings or you. Nishida asserts, quote, the true a priori would have to be that which constitutes its own content within itself. Thus we may conceive, as in Lask, a domain category, Gebietskategorie, beyond constitutive form, to see universal concepts determined in the object realm of our cognition is due to this place of determining itself, unquote. A few years later, he asserts that Lask's domain, Gebiet, is founded upon such determination, that is, a self-determination. The domain category of the valid as the primal form, form, the form of forms, corresponds in Nishida to the intelligible world, Eijiteki Sekai, wherein we live in interpersonal connections with each other in the concrete situatedness of the place of true nothing. As in Lask's domain category of the valid, the intelligible world for Nishida is precognitively experienced, for validity and values are found in the concrete situatedness of our livid experience, providing the guiding horizon for acts of consciousness, and for, quote, the emotive interpenetration between mutually intuiting persons, unquote. Nishida understands this alogical livid experience as a kind of place, or basho, that is perilogical, horonriteki, enveloping its articulations in judgment. And in the same way that Lask's domain category, as itself valid, therefore is not, the universal place embracing the intelligible world in all beings for Nishida is nothing, mu. Nishida repeatedly refers to Lask's transcendent trans-oppositional or chō-tairitsu-teki or oppositionless object tairitsu-naki taisho. With Lask's object paradigm in mind, he explicates it as the object of how we ought to think, toitekshi no taisho. But in experiencing it, we are beyond the field of experience that establishes judicative oppositional content. Thus, the place that establishes but in experiencing it, we are beyond the field of consciousness that establishes judicative oppositional content. Thus, quote, the place that establishes the opposition of form and matter and the place that establishes the opposition of true and false must be distinct, unquote. The former refers to the world of livid experience, and the latter refers to the field of consciousness. So he asks, quote, what kind of thing is Lask's oppositionless object that utterly transcends acts, unquote, and responds that, quote, even this object must be emplaced somewhere, unquote. In the issue of consciousness remaining, he states that when consciousness conceived as a place of nothing becomes an absolute nothing, quote, what is emplaced there is the oppositionless object, unquote. But once cognized and judged, its experience is abstracted and dichotomized into subject-object, or predicate-subject. Nishida thus provisionally accepts Lask's logical objectivism while grounding its object-centrism upon the deeper standpoint of place. He looks to the placial character of self-realization as the self-determination of that which precedes and exceeds both subject and object of cognition, whereby knowing is the self-formation of the formless. Akin to Lask's transcendent sphere, the originary sphere for Nishida is not yet divided by oppositions. But whereas Lask understands this in terms of an object, Nishida takes it as a place. On that basis, quote, to cognize is none other than for experience to form itself within itself. And the so-called subject-object opposition is realized in what endlessly mirrors itself within itself. That which contains endless beings by itself becoming nothing, unquote. He adds, quote, it is a place that we can neither say is identical, nor that it is different, neither that is being, nor nothing, a place that cannot be determined by so-called logical forms, but instead permits the establishment of logical forms, unquote. Thus, the true form of forms must be a place of forms. That was a quotation, too. He pursues the form of forms in the direction of the knower as something, he says, something like a place. But thereby, quote, consciousness of the oppositionless object does not mean that consciousness transcends itself, but that consciousness deeply enters into itself. One speaks of this as transcendence only because one is seeing this simply as a relationship of objects, without deeply thinking of the essence of consciousness itself, unquote. We might characterize this rather as a transdescendence into the deeper, pre-epistemic place that envelops our lived experience, a descent into that pre-subjective place. But in suggesting the primal interfusion of meaning and being, in suggesting the primal interfusion of being and meaning in lived experience, Lask had provided a clue for Nishida. Lask's interfusion of form and matter for Nishida is the self-formation of true nothing. Nishida thus sought to bridge the dualistic gap by taking the divide as the self-articulation of the self-determining nothing. Hylomorphism thus collapses into the self-forming formlessness of place, the event of reality come experience. So now we're in our final section, the conclusion. Heidegger and Nishida found in Lask a clue to surmounting dualism while recognizing the limits of his logical objectivism. Both were led to transcend subjectivity to look at its pre-thematic engagement with the world. It led Heidegger to our finite being there. For Nishida, it led to our emplacement. Both were led to the lived world of meaning. One important development of Heidegger's appropriation of Lask is the ontological difference, but there is an analogous development in Nishida. For Lask, being as a domain category is valid, but not a being. Heidegger understands being in terms of meaning, associating this with the horizon of our being in the world. Nishida associates validity qua intelligible world with place, wherein beings arise and disappear. Akin to the valid in Lask, that place is ultimately a nothing in distinction from beings. For Heidegger also, being is not, hence a nothing. For all three, what envelops beings is not a being. And if form is the material's involvement, it implies context, which both Heidegger and Nishida understands in terms of the world. In Heidegger's involvement as constitutive of the meaning of handy things, ultimately points to the contextualizing horizon towards which one is thrown. In Nishida, the constitution of objects by the predicate ultimately points to the intelligible world as place. Both also assume Lask's notion of absorption, Hingabe, whereby we are immersed prior to judgment in that already meaningful world. The hylomorphic collapse in that lived wherein is another consequence of their radicalization of Lask. Heidegger transmutes the interfusion of form and matter into the projection and thrownness of being there. Nishida collapses the hylomorphic duality into the self-forming formlessness. Lask spurred both thinkers beyond Kantian dichotomies, but also beyond his own object-centered logic towards the lived realm of meaning as the true a priori, preceding objects. And that's the end of my paper, and I do have footnotes, but I won't read the footnotes. And if you have any comments, please let me know, and I'll be looking forward to reading everyone else's paper or seeing your presentations, I guess, in the next couple of weeks probably. Thank you. Bye-bye.